Some promises wait so long to be heard that they change the lives of everyone who finally listens. Rain hammered the glass roof of the bus stop in downtown Chicago, turning the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and white. Cars hissed across the wet pavement. Neon reflections rippled through puddles like broken pieces of another world. 7-year-old Lucy Foster sat alone on a cold metal bench, her small sneakers dangling several inches above the ground. She clutched an old envelope against her chest as if it was something fragile enough to disappear. The paper was yellowed with age. Its corners were bent. A faint water stain had spread across one side years ago and never faded. Most children her age carried stuffed animals or tablets. Lucy carried a letter. Across the street, office workers hurried through the storm beneath umbrellas. Nobody noticed the little girl studying the faded handwriting on the envelope for what felt like the 100th time. She couldn't read every word. She only recognized a few letters. The name written on the front remained a mystery. Evelyn Foster would normally never allow her niece to wander off alone after school, but today had been different. The old storage box had finally been opened. The one that had sat untouched for years in the back of a closet. The one that had belonged to Lucy's mother. Inside had been photographs, birthday cards, and at the very bottom this letter, a letter nobody seemed to know existed. Lucy traced her finger over the handwriting again. Her mother had written it, that much she knew. Evelyn had gone pale the moment she saw it. Then she had quickly placed it back into the box and changed the subject. But Lucy couldn't stop thinking about it. Her mother had passed away when she was very young. There were so many questions nobody could answer anymore. Questions that seemed to grow larger every year. Who had this letter been for? Why had it never been mailed? And why did her aunt look so nervous whenever she asked? The storm intensified. Thunder rolled somewhere above the skyscrapers. Lucy tightened her grip on the envelope. Then she noticed someone standing at the far end of the bus shelter, a tall man dressed in a long black coat. He had arrived so quietly she hadn't seen him approach. Rain streamed from the edge of his umbrella. Most people looked tired after a long day in Chicago. Perfectly still, perfectly composed. He stood near the curb with his hands folded behind his back, watching traffic move through the storm. Lucy studied him with the fearless curiosity only children possess. He didn't look dangerous. He looked lonely. A city bus rumbled past without stopping. The wind pushed Rain sideways beneath the shelter. The man glanced toward her briefly. His face was strikingly pale beneath the streetlights. His dark hair was neatly combed back. His expression revealed almost nothing. Yet there was something about his eyes that made him seem older than everyone else around him. Much older. What Lucy couldn't possibly know was that fewer than 3 miles away, an entire gathering of vampire nobility was waiting for that man to arrive. What she couldn't know was that some people crossed oceans to gain 5 minutes of his attention. And what she definitely couldn't know was that the name Sebastian Morelli carried enough power to make supernatural courts fall silent. To Lucy, he was simply a stranger standing in the rain. She slid off the bench and walked toward him. The envelope crinkled softly in her hands. The man looked down as she stopped beside him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Lucy lifted the letter. "Excuse me, mister," she said. "Do you know how to read old handwriting?" Sebastian Morelli stared at the child. The question was so unexpected that he almost smiled. "Almost. Sometimes," he answered. His voice was calm and low. Lucy brightened immediately. "Good, because I think this letter is important." She carefully offered him the envelope. Sebastian accepted it out of simple politeness. His eyes lowered toward the faded writing. The moment he saw the name written across the front, the world seemed to stop moving. The traffic noise vanished. The rain disappeared. Even the storm itself felt distant. Because written in delicate handwriting across the envelope were 4 words he had not seen in nearly 18 years, to Sebastian Morelli. And beneath it, signed in smaller letters, was a name he had spent almost 2 decades trying to forget: Grace Foster. At that exact moment, for the first time in many years, the Vampire King turned pale. The little bus shelter seemed suddenly too small for the silence that followed. Rain drummed against the glass panels. Water streamed down the streets in silver ribbons. Lucy looked up at the tall stranger, unaware that the color had drained from his face. Sebastian Morelli stared at the envelope as though it had appeared from another lifetime. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every curve of every letter carried the memory he had once searched for across cities, across decades, and across countless sleepless nights. Grace Foster. The name echoed through him like a distant bell. Lucy shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Did you know my mum?" she asked. Her voice was small, but it cut through the noise of the storm more effectively than thunder. Sebastian lowered the envelope slowly. For a moment he seemed unable to answer. Few people had ever seen the Vampire King hesitate. Fewer still had witnessed genuine surprise in his eyes. Yet the child standing before him had managed both in less than 60 seconds. "Your mother?" he repeated carefully. Lucy nodded. The letter was hers. "Aunt Evelyn says she wrote it a long time ago." Sebastian looked at the envelope again. The paper was old, older than it should have been. The edges were worn from years of being moved from one forgotten place to another. Something about that detail bothered him immediately. Grace had never been careless. If she had written this letter, she had intended it to be delivered. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "In a box." Lucy smiled faintly. It was hidden with pictures. A distant flash of lightning illuminated the city skyline. For an instant, the wet streets glowed white. Sebastian studied the child more closely. She had her mother's eyes, not identical, but close enough to awaken memories he had spent years trying to bury. The same kindness, the same quiet determination. The resemblance tightened something inside his chest. Less than 3 miles away, chauffeurs, advisors, and members of the vampire court continued waiting for his arrival. Phone calls had already begun. Security teams were searching the city. Nobody understood why their king had disappeared from his schedule. Unfortunately for them, Sebastian had forgotten the gala entirely. The envelope in his hand had become the only thing that mattered. "Can you read it?" Lucy asked hopefully. "I tried, but some words are hard." Sebastian had never been opened, not once. That realization unsettled him even more. 18 years, and the letter remained untouched. "Not here," he said quietly. "Why not?" "Because some letters deserve a little more care." Lucy considered that answer seriously. Then she nodded as if it made perfect sense. The rain began to ease. Across the street, headlights swept through the darkness. A black luxury sedan rolled silently toward the curb and stopped. The driver stepped out immediately, concern visible on his face. He had clearly been searching for someone. His eyes widened the moment he spotted Sebastian. "Sir," the driver said carefully, "everyone has been looking for you." Sebastian never remainder of the evening. The driver blinked. "Sir, everything." The man hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course." Lucy stared at the expensive car, then at Sebastian, then back at the car again. Children often notice things adults overlooked. "You must be important," she said. A faint smile touched Sebastian's face for the first time. "Not tonight." Before Lucy could respond, another voice called her name from across the street. "Lucy." Evelyn Foster rushed through the fading rain, her coat half-buttoned and her expression filled with panic. She reached the shelter moments later and immediately wrapped her arms around her niece. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Lucy pointed excitedly at Sebastian. "I found someone who can read Mom's letter." Evelyn followed her finger. The moment her eyes landed on the man holding the envelope, she froze. Sebastian recognized the resemblance instantly. The same family features, the same eyes, the same history. And as Evelyn stared at him beneath the glow of the streetlights, she slowly realized that the stranger holding her sister's lost letter somehow already knew exactly who Grace Foster had been. Some names belonged to the past. Others refused to stay there. For several long seconds nobody moved beneath the shelter. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the glass roof. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again. Yet the moment felt suspended outside time. Evelyn Foster stood frozen beside her niece, staring at the man holding the envelope. She had never met Sebastian Morelli before, at least not officially, but she knew the name. Years ago, she had heard it whispered during late-night conversations she was never supposed to overhear. Conversations her older sister always ended abruptly whenever anyone entered the room. Lucy looked from one adult to the other. "Do you know each other?" she asked. Neither answered immediately. "Sebastian, you are Evelyn Foster." It was not a question. Evelyn felt a chill despite the humid summer air. "How do you know my name?" she asked quietly. Sebastian lowered his gaze toward the envelope. Lucy's eyes widened instantly. "You knew, Mom?" The excitement in her voice was immediate and genuine. Evelyn, however, felt something entirely different. Unease, questions, concern. Her protective instincts sharpened at once. She stepped slightly closer to Lucy. "What exactly did my sister tell you about herself?" Sebastian studied her carefully. The resemblance to Grace was impossible to ignore now. Similar eyes, similar posture. The same stubborn determination. Yet there was also caution in Evelyn that Grace had never possessed. Grace had always believed the best about people, sometimes too easily. Not enough, Sebastian answered after a moment. That appears to be the problem. A gust of wind pushed Rain across the sidewalk. The driver remained beside the black sedan, wisely keeping his distance. He sensed this conversation mattered. Very few people interrupted Sebastian Morelli when that expression appeared on his face. Lucy tugged gently on Evelyn's sleeve. "Can he read the letter?" she whispered. Evelyn looked down at her niece, then back toward Sebastian. The envelope suddenly felt far more significant than it had an hour earlier. "What is in it?" Evelyn asked. Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on the faded handwriting. "I do not know. Then why do you look like you have seen a ghost?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Sebastian did not react, but something flickered behind his calm expression. Not anger. Not offense. Something older, regret. Across the city, thunder rolled again. Dark clouds continued drifting above the skyline. The storm was moving east now, carrying the worst of the rain with it. "Because," Sebastian said quietly, "I spent 18 years believing there were words I would never hear." Evelyn stared at him. 18 years. The number struck her immediately. It matched almost perfectly with the period before Grace disappeared from their lives, before the unexplained silence. Lucy hugged the strap of her backpack. "Then maybe you should read it." Her voice was so simple, so sincere, neither adult could argue with the logic. Sebastian looked down at the child. For a brief moment, something softened in his expression. What she could not know was that she had just said the exact thing Grace would have said, direct, honest, impossible to ignore. Unfortunately for everyone standing there, another realization was beginning to form in Sebastian's mind. The envelope had never been opened. The paper showed no sign of tampering, no crease from unfolding, no broken seal, which meant one impossible fact remained staring directly at him. Grace had written the letter. Grace had addressed it to him, yet somehow it had never arrived. Not 10 years ago, not even 6 years ago before her death. The realization settled over him slowly, like a gathering storm. Someone had stopped it. Someone had prevented those words from reaching him, and if that was true, then everything he believed about Grace Foster might be wrong. Sebastian lifted his eyes toward Evelyn. "There is somewhere we need to go," he said. Evelyn immediately frowned. "Where?" He glanced once more at the envelope resting in his hand. Then he looked back at her. "Somewhere we can finally open this." And as lightning flashed far beyond the city skyline, neither Evelyn nor Lucy realized that the sealed letter between them had just transformed from a family keepsake into the first piece of a mystery buried for nearly 2 decades. The city looked completely different from the back seat of Sebastian Morelli's car. Rain slid across the windows in shimmering waves. Downtown Chicago drifted in streaks of gold, red, and silver light. Lucy sat quietly beside Evelyn, hugging her backpack while occasionally glancing toward the sealed envelope resting in Sebastian's hands. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The silence felt strangely delicate, as though one careless sentence might break something important. Eventually the car turned away from the crowded streets and entered a quieter section of the city lined with historic buildings. Tall trees swayed gently beneath the fading storm clouds. Iron gates opened automatically as the vehicle approached. Beyond them stood a massive stone residence illuminated by warm lights glowing through tall windows. Lucy pressed her face against the glass. "You live here?" she asked. Sebastian nodded once. Most days. The answer made Evelyn glance toward him. It was such an odd way to describe a home. Before she could question it, the car stopped beneath a covered entrance. A staff member opened the door immediately. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors reflected soft chandelier light. Dark wood paneling lined the walls. Ancient paintings hung in elegant frames. Yet despite its size, the house felt unusually quiet. Not empty, simply still. Like a place where people spoke softly out of respect for something older than themselves. Lucy looked around in amazement. "This is bigger than our whole apartment building." A faint smile touched Sebastian's face again. "That is probably true." He guided them toward a private library at the far end of the residence. The room felt warmer than the rest of the house. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of books filled every wall. A fire crackled quietly inside a stone fireplace. The scent of old paper and cedar drifted through the air. For the first time since entering the estate, Evelyn felt some of her tension ease. This room did not feel intimidating. It felt lived in, loved. Sebastian crossed to a large wooden table near the fire and carefully placed the envelope at its center. Everyone's attention immediately shifted toward it. 18 years. The number seemed impossible, yet the evidence sat directly in front of them. Lucy climbed into a chair and folded her hands on the table. "Can we read it now?" she asked. His Sebastian stared at the calm, but there was something different in his eyes now. Not fear, anticipation. The kind that arrives when someone stands on the edge of a truth they have waited years to discover. Evelyn noticed it too. "Before you open that," she said quietly, "I want answers." Sebastian looked at her. "What do you want to know? Who were you to my sister?" The question lingered in the room. Even the crackling fireplace seemed quieter afterward. Sebastian lowered his gaze briefly. For several seconds he appeared to be searching for the correct words. "Someone who failed her," he finally said. Evelyn frowned. The answer raised far more questions than it resolved. "What does that mean?" Sebastian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward one of the bookshelves, toward a section that seemed untouched for years. "It means there was a time when I believed your sister chose to leave without explanation." His voice remained steady, "and now I am beginning to wonder if that belief was wrong." Lucy listened carefully, despite understanding only part of the conversation. One thing, however, became very clear. This stranger had cared about her mother, deeply. The realization made her look at him differently, not as a powerful man in a large house, just a person carrying an old sadness. Sebastian reached for the envelope. His fingers paused above the seal. Then something caught his attention, a detail so small most people would never notice it. A faint mark pressed into the paper near the back flap. Not damage, not age, a symbol, tiny, deliberate. His expression changed instantly. Evelyn saw it happen. "What is it?" she asked. Sebastian leaned closer. The mark was unmistakable. He had seen it before, years ago, somewhere connected to Grace, somewhere important. Slowly, very slowly, he turned the envelope over and studied the faded imprint. Because at that exact moment, before the letter had even been opened, Sebastian realized there was something hidden on the envelope itself that should not have been there at all. Some clues do not hide inside a letter. They hide on the outside, waiting for someone to notice them years later. The library grew quiet as Sebastian held the envelope beneath the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. Shadows danced across the shelves behind him. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Lucy leaned forward in her chair, curiosity shining in her eyes. Evelyn watched from across the table, her attention fixed entirely on Sebastian's expression. Whatever he had recognized, it clearly mattered. Sebastian traced the faint symbol with the tip of his finger. Time had nearly erased it, but not completely. The mark resembled a small crest pressed into the paper by an official seal. Most people would have mistaken it for damage. He knew better. 18 years ago, certain documents connected to his private affairs had carried the same imprint. Not public correspondence, not business records. Internal courier transfers handled by a very small circle of trusted individuals. Trusted. The word left an unpleasant taste in his mouth. Slowly, he placed the envelope back on the table. Sebastian remained silent for a moment. "A mark that should not be here." Lucy tilted her head. "Is it a secret code?" Despite everything, the question almost made him smile. "Something like that." Evelyn crossed her arms. "You are being very mysterious." "Because I do not have answers yet." He looked down at the envelope again. "Only questions." The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, the storm continued moving away from the city. The worst of the rain had passed, leaving only occasional drops sliding down the glass. Sebastian finally reached for a small letter opener resting beside a stack of books. The silver blade caught the light briefly. Across the table, Lucy held her breath. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. 18 years of silence rested beneath that seal. Carefully, Sebastian opened the envelope. The paper inside made a faint whisper as he unfolded it. One page, front and back, written entirely in Grace's handwriting. He recognized it instantly. Every letter, every small habit she had when writing certain words. For several seconds he simply stared at the page, not reading, remembering. Then he began. The room remained completely silent. Lucy watched his eyes move slowly across the first lines. Evelyn watched his face. The words themselves remained hidden from them. Only Sebastian could see them. Only Sebastian could hear Grace's voice returning through the years. His expression changed gradually. First surprise, then confusion, then something deeper, sadness. Not the sharp kind, the quiet kind that arrives when someone realizes a memory may have been wrong all along. Evelyn noticed it immediately. "What does it say?" she asked softly. Sebastian did not answer. He continued reading. Grace wrote about ordinary things at first, small things, a rainy afternoon, a bookstore they once visited together, a promise she hoped he still remembered. Lucy smiled faintly. "That sounds like Mom." Sebastian glanced toward her briefly. "Yes," he said, "it does." Then he returned to the letter. Several more lines passed beneath his eyes. Suddenly his hand stopped moving. Complete stillness settled over him. The room seemed to shrink around the table. Evelyn sat forward. "Sebastian?" He did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on a single sentence near the center of the page. One sentence that changed everything. One sentence that should never have existed if the story he believed for 18 years had been true. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered the letter. "That is impossible," he whispered. Evelyn's stomach tightened. "What is impossible?" Sebastian looked directly at her. For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "According to this letter," he said quietly, "your sister believed I never received her previous messages." Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. Lucy looked between them, confused. Evelyn felt the meaning arrive a second later. Previous messages, not one letter, multiple letters. Multiple attempts to contact him. The realization struck like a sudden flash of lightning. If Grace had truly been writing to Sebastian all those years ago, then one terrible question remained. Where had the rest of those letters gone? Sometimes the most painful discoveries are not the answers people find, but the questions those answers create. The library remained silent after Sebastian spoke. The fire crackled softly behind him. Shadows shifted across rows of books that had stood for generations. Evelyn stared at the letter resting in his hands, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Multiple letters, not one, not two. Enough that Grace had expected replies. Enough that she eventually noticed none were coming. Lucy looked confused. "Maybe they got lost," she offered. The simple explanation hung in the air. Children often searched for the easiest answer first. Adults knew life rarely cooperated. Sebastian lowered his gaze toward the page again. "That would be possible," he said quietly, "if it had happened once." He turned the letter slightly so the light illuminated several lines near the center. "Not if it happened over and over." Evelyn felt a knot forming in her stomach. The image of her sister began returning piece by piece. Grace sitting at the kitchen table late at night. Grace checking the mailbox. Grace pretending everything was fine whenever anyone asked questions. At the time, Evelyn had been too young to understand. Looking back now, certain memories suddenly felt different, more significant, more troubling. "She never talked about him," Evelyn said softly. Sebastian listened, not directly. Evelyn shook her head. There were moments, strange moments. She stared into the fire as old memories resurfaced. Sometimes she would spend hours writing. Then she would leave the apartment carrying envelopes. Sebastian remained very still. And afterward, she always seemed hopeful. Evelyn swallowed. For a while, the room grew quiet again. Lucy hugged her knees beneath the chair. Even she could feel the sadness creeping into the conversation. Unfortunately for all of them, another detail inside the letter continued pulling at Sebastian's attention. He returned to the page and carefully read several more paragraphs. Grace's words carried the same warmth he remembered, the same kindness, the same stubborn belief that people deserved second chances. Yet underneath those familiar qualities, another emotion became increasingly clear: confusion. She genuinely did not understand why he never answered. Not anger, not resentment, confusion. That realization unsettled him more than anything else, because 18 years earlier, he had believed something completely different. He had believed she chose silence, chose distance, chose a life without him. Every decision he made afterward had been built upon that assumption. Now the foundation beneath those memories was beginning to crack. "What else does it say?" Evelyn finally asked. Sebastian hesitated. Then he read aloud. "I keep telling myself there must be a reason. Maybe the letters are not reaching you. Maybe someone is standing between us. I do not know anymore." The words seemed to echo through the library long after he finished speaking. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Lucy looked down at the table. For the first time that evening, even she sensed the weight of what her mother had written. "Someone is standing between us." Sebastian repeated the sentence silently, not because of the emotion behind it, because of the possibility hidden inside it. The mark on the envelope, the missing letters, the unanswered messages. Suddenly they no longer felt like separate mysteries. They felt connected. His attention shifted toward a grandfather clock standing near the far wall. Midnight approached, then another memory surfaced, a small detail from nearly 2 decades ago, something insignificant at the time. A trusted courier mentioning delayed correspondence, a document that arrived late. He had ignored it. Why would he not? There had been no reason to suspect anything until now. Slowly he stood from the table. Evelyn watched him carefully. "What is it?" she asked. Sebastian looked toward the dark windows overlooking the estate grounds. "There may be a way to verify something." "Verify what?" He turned back toward her. His expression had changed again, less uncertainty. More focus. The date. Evelyn frowned. What date? Sebastian walked back toward the table and pointed to the top corner of the letter. The day your sister wrote this. Evelyn leaned closer. Lucy did the same, and as all three studied the faded ink beneath the warm library light, they realized the date written on the page did not match the timeline they had believed for nearly 18 years. The truth had been sitting on the page the entire time. Nobody had noticed because they had been looking at the words instead of the date. Evelyn leaned closer beneath the warm glow of the reading lamp. Lucy climbed halfway out of her chair to see better. Sebastian remained standing beside the table, his eyes fixed on the faded numbers written in Grace's careful handwriting. The date did not belong where it was. It should have appeared years earlier according to everything he believed. Instead, it told an entirely different story. That cannot be right, Evelyn whispered. Sebastian said nothing. He simply turned the page toward her. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Grace had written the letter months after the moment Sebastian believed she had already disappeared from his life forever. Months after the silence began. Months after he convinced himself she had chosen not to contact him. Evelyn read the date again. Then her pulse quickened. If this is correct, she said slowly, then she was still trying to reach you long after everyone thought she stopped. Sebastian lowered himself into the chair. For the first time that evening, he looked tired, not physically, emotionally, as though 18 years of certainty had suddenly become a burden too heavy to carry. Lucy looked between them. Is that good? She asked. Neither adult answered immediately, because the answer was both yes and no. Good because Grace had not given up. Good because she had tried. Good because she had cared enough to keep writing. But terrible because it meant something else had happened. Something none of them understood yet. Sebastian returned his attention to the letter. This time he read the remaining paragraphs more carefully. Every sentence sharpened the same conclusion. Grace believed her messages were not reaching him. Grace believed something was interfering. Grace believed he would answer if he knew. The realization settled over the room like a second storm. Outside, the clouds were finally breaking apart. Moonlight began appearing between them. Silver light touched the windows. Inside the library, a far more important darkness was lifting, slowly, painfully. Read the last section, Evelyn said. Sebastian nodded. His voice remained quiet as he spoke the words aloud. If this letter reaches you, then perhaps there is still hope. If it does not, then I suppose I will never know why. But I need you to understand one thing. Silence followed. Lucy lowered her eyes. Even she could feel the emotion hidden inside those words. Evelyn pressed her hand against her mouth. Across the table, Sebastian stared at the page without moving. He had spent 18 years believing Grace walked away, 18 years believing she chose silence, 18 years carrying resentment that now seemed increasingly undeserved. The letter had changed everything, not because it answered the mystery, because it destroyed the lie he had built his life around. Unfortunately, one question remained. If Grace never stopped writing, where were the other letters? Sebastian rose suddenly and crossed the room toward a large antique desk near the fireplace. He opened a locked drawer and removed a leather archive ledger. Dust coated the cover. The book had not been touched in years. Evelyn watched him return to the table. What is that? She asked. Courage records. He opened the ledger carefully. Hundreds of names filled the pages. Dates, deliveries, every piece of correspondence handled by his private network during that period. Lucy blinked. You kept all of that? I keep everything. Sebastian turned page after page. The room grew quieter with every second. Then his hand stopped. Evelyn saw it immediately. What did you find? Sebastian looked down at a specific entry written nearly 18 years ago. One name, one route, one delivery record. And beside it a notation that should never have existed, because according to the ledger, Grace Foster's final letter had been received for transport. But it had never been delivered. Records rarely lie. People do. The realization settled over the library with unsettling weight. Sebastian stood motionless beside the antique desk, his eyes fixed on the faded ledger entry. Evelyn rose from her chair and crossed the room. Lucy followed close behind, curiosity overcoming exhaustion. Together they looked down at the yellowed page. The handwriting belonged to an administrator who had served Sebastian's household nearly 2 decades earlier. Every delivery had been carefully documented. Every route had been logged. Every courier had been assigned by name. Most entries contained simple notations. Delivered, received, confirmed. This one was different. Grace Foster. Private correspondence. Received for transport. Then a second note written several days later. Delivery suspended. Authorization pending. Evelyn frowned. What does that mean? Sebastian's jaw tightened. It means the letter entered the system. And then someone stopped it. The room fell silent. Lucy looked confused. Why would anybody do that? No one answered immediately, because none of them knew yet. Sebastian turned several more pages. His movements became faster now, more focused. The uncertainty that had haunted him earlier was slowly giving way to determination. He was no longer searching for possibilities. He was searching for proof. Outside, the storm had finally passed. Moonlight spilled across the estate grounds, illuminating wet stone pathways and rows of ancient trees. Inside the library, only the sound of turning pages disturbed the silence. Then Sebastian stopped again. Another name appeared beside the suspended delivery record. Not Grace's, not a courier's, a supervisor's authorization code. Evelyn saw the change in his expression immediately. You recognize that? She asked. Yes. His voice was quiet, dangerous only in its certainty. I do. Lucy climbed onto a nearby chair to see better. The name meant nothing to her. It meant everything to Sebastian, Adrian Keller. 18 years ago, he had overseen a portion of Sebastian's private correspondence network. Trusted, efficient, meticulous, a man who had disappeared from service shortly afterward under circumstances that had never seemed important at the time. Until now, memories surfaced one after another, small details he had ignored, reports arriving late, administrative discrepancies, complaints that never seemed significant, pieces of a puzzle scattered across nearly 2 decades. Evelyn folded her arms. You think this person intercepted the letters? I think he had the authority to do it. Sebastian closed the ledger slowly, and according to these records, he used that authority. Lucy looked down at the letter resting on the table. So Mom really tried? The question struck harder than either adult expected. Sebastian turned toward her. For a moment the library seemed to disappear. The records, the mystery, the years of misunderstanding, all of it faded behind one simple truth. Grace had tried. Again and again. The evidence was finally becoming impossible to deny. Yes, he said softly. She did. Lucy smiled. Not because she understood the entire mystery, because she understood something more important. Her mother had not been forgotten. Evelyn felt tears gathering unexpectedly and looked away toward the fireplace. For years she had quietly wondered whether Grace had spent her final years carrying regret, wondering if she had been abandoned, wondering if her efforts had meant nothing. Now that story was beginning to unravel. Unfortunately, another discovery waited just beyond reach. Sebastian reopened the ledger and examined the final notation beneath Adrian Keller's authorization code. A location, not an address. A storage archive. One that should no longer exist. His eyes narrowed. Evelyn turned back immediately. What now? Sebastian pointed toward the notation. According to this record, any suspended correspondence was transferred to an off-site archive. So? Evelyn asked. Sebastian looked directly at her. That archive was closed 17 years ago. Lucy blinked. Then how can it still be in the book? Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on the page. Because if the record was accurate, somewhere in Chicago there might still be an entire collection of letters that were never meant to disappear, and among them could be every message Grace Foster ever tried to send. The city was asleep by the time they left the library. Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath clearing clouds as the black sedan moved through quiet streets washed clean by rain. Lucy had fallen asleep against Evelyn's shoulder, clutching her backpack as though she feared the letter might somehow disappear again. The child looked peaceful, unaware that the mystery surrounding her mother had become far larger than anyone imagined. Evelyn stared out the window while Sebastian sat across from them, reviewing copies of the archive records. Streetlights flashed across his face in brief intervals of gold and shadow. Neither spoke much during the drive. Both were trapped inside the same question: what if the missing letters still existed? 20 minutes later, the car turned into an older industrial district near the river. Most of the warehouses had been converted into offices years ago. Others stood abandoned behind chain-link fences and weathered brick walls. The area felt frozen in time. A forgotten corner of the city that progress had somehow missed. Sebastian stepped from the vehicle first. Cool night air carried the scent of wet concrete and distant water. Evelyn carefully woke Lucy. Within moments, all three stood facing a narrow brick building squeezed between two larger structures. No sign hung above the entrance, no lights shone from the windows, yet according to the records, this had once been the storage archive referenced in the ledger. This place? Evelyn asked. It looks empty. It should be. Sebastian replied. That is what concerns me. Moonlight reflected off puddles as they approached the front entrance. The building appeared abandoned, but closer inspection revealed something unusual. The lock had been replaced recently, but certainly not 17 years ago. Sebastian noticed immediately, so did Evelyn. "Someone still comes here," she said, apparently. A few minutes later they were inside. Dust covered most surfaces. Old filing cabinets lined the walls. Rows of storage shelves stretched through narrow aisles, disappearing into darkness. The air smelled of paper, age, and forgotten history. Lucy stayed close beside Evelyn. The place felt more like a giant attic than an archive. Sebastian moved carefully between shelves, studying faded labels attached to hundreds of boxes. Many sections had been emptied long ago, others remained untouched. Unfortunately for him, the organization system was painfully familiar. The archive had not been abandoned, it had simply been hidden. His eyes moved across category markers, financial records, property transfers, internal correspondence. Then he stopped. Correspondence. Evelyn saw the change immediately. "What did you find?" Without answering, Sebastian stepped toward a row of grey storage containers stacked along the back wall. Years of dust coated their lids. One label remained partially visible beneath the grime. Suspended deliveries. For a moment nobody moved. Even Lucy sensed the significance. Sebastian carefully lifted the lid from the nearest container. Inside sat hundreds of sealed envelopes, organized by date. Years of forgotten communication preserved exactly where someone had left it. Evelyn's breath caught. "Oh my God." Sebastian reached inside and began examining names. Most meant nothing, then another box, another row, another year. His movements grew faster. Hope and dread battled silently across his expression. Because every envelope represented a message that never reached its destination. Every envelope represented a life altered by silence. Then it happened. His hand froze over a familiar name, Grace Foster. The envelope looked almost identical to the one Lucy had found. Same handwriting, same careful script, same recipient, Sebastian Morelli. Evelyn stared at it in disbelief. Then another appeared beneath it, and another, and another. Not one missing letter, not two, at least seven. 7 separate attempts. 7 messages that should have reached him. 7 messages someone had deliberately removed from circulation. Lucy looked up at Sebastian. Mom really kept trying. He nodded slowly, unable to look away from the stack of envelopes in his hands. Because for the first time in 18 years, proof finally existed. Grace had never abandoned him. She had never stopped writing, and buried beneath the final envelope was a small folded document carrying a familiar signature. Adrian Keller. Some signatures carry more weight than confessions. The forgotten archive seemed smaller now. The mystery that had stretched across 18 years was finally beginning to narrow into something tangible. Sebastian stood beneath a dim overhead light holding the folded document signed by Adrian Keller. Dust floated through the air like pale mist. Nearby, Evelyn carefully gathered Grace's letters while Lucy sat on an old storage crate watching every movement with wide eyes. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a crime scene created by silence instead of violence. Sebastian unfolded the document. The paper crackled softly. Time had yellowed its edges, but the writing remained clear. At first glance it appeared administrative. A routine transfer authorization. The kind of paperwork most people would never read twice. Then his eyes reached the final paragraph. Everything changed. Evelyn immediately noticed the shift in his expression. "What does it say?" she asked. Sebastian read the passage again before answering. "It is a directive." His voice was low, controlled, a standing order. He handed the page to her. Evelyn scanned the text. The language was formal, dry, bureaucratic, yet the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. Certain categories of correspondence addressed to Sebastian were to be reviewed before delivery, not by a committee, not by a department, by Adrian Keller personally. Lucy tilted her head. Evelyn looked up from the page. "Very." Sebastian continued examining the remaining records inside the container. More signatures appeared, more transfer approvals, more evidence that the missing letters had not disappeared accidentally. They had been redirected intentionally. The realization settled heavily over everyone present. Grace had done everything she could. She had written. She had waited. She had written again. And someone had quietly ensured her words never arrived. Unfortunately for Adrian Keller, he had left behind far more evidence than he realized. Tucked inside one of the folders was a personnel file. Sebastian opened it immediately. The document listed addresses, assignments, promotions, and retirement records. One line stood out. Keller had not vanished after leaving Sebastian's service. He had accepted a private consulting position with a financial group operating in northern Illinois. Evelyn stepped closer. "Can we find him?" Sebastian studied the file. "Possibly." He turned another page, then another. Suddenly he stopped. There it was, a final recorded address. Not current, not recent, but enough to begin. Lucy looked between them. If we find him, can he tell us why? That is exactly what I intend to ask. Less than an hour later, they were back inside the estate library. The stack of recovered letters sat neatly arranged across the table. 8 envelopes, 8 opportunities for truth. Outside, dawn remained several hours away. Inside, nobody felt tired anymore. Too much had changed. Evelyn carefully opened the earliest letter. Her eyes moved across the page. Then she handed it to Sebastian without speaking. He read silently. Grace's words filled the room again. Hope, patience, faith. Every letter carried the same belief that eventually he would answer. Lucy listened as portions were read aloud. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she grew quiet. Each page revealed a little more about the mother she barely remembered. Then they reached the final recovered envelope. The last message before the letter Lucy discovered. Sebastian opened it carefully. The date immediately caught his attention. It was only 3 weeks before Grace stopped writing entirely. His eyes moved down the page. Then he froze. Evelyn noticed first. "What is it now?" Sebastian slowly lowered the letter. There was no uncertainty left in his expression. No doubt. Only sorrow. Because hidden inside Grace's final message was one devastating sentence that explained why she never wrote again. She believed Sebastian had made the decision to ignore her forever. The hardest truths are often hidden inside the final words people leave behind. The library remained silent except for the faint crackling of the fire. Dawn was still hours away, yet nobody seemed aware of the passing time. The stack of recovered letters rested on the table like pieces of a life that had finally found its way home. Sebastian sat motionless with Grace's final letter in his hands. Across from him, Evelyn watched carefully. Lucy had curled up beneath a blanket on a nearby sofa, fighting sleep but refusing to leave the room. She wanted to hear every part of her mother's story. Sebastian looked down at the sentence again. The ink had faded slightly with age, but the meaning remained painfully clear. Grace believed he had chosen silence. She believed he had received her letters and decided not to answer. The misunderstanding struck him harder than any accusation could have, because now he knew exactly what had happened. She had spent years waiting for a reply that never came. He had spent years believing she no longer wanted one. 2 lives had been pulled apart by a lie, neither of them creolence. Read the rest. Sebastian nodded slowly. His voice remained steady, but something deeper lived beneath it now. Regret. If you have chosen not to answer, I will respect that decision. I only wish you had told me yourself. I would have understood. I always believed honesty mattered more than promises. The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. Lucy looked down at her hands. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Grace had never sounded angry, not even at the end. Only disappointed, heartbroken, and somehow still kind. Sebastian continued reading. I hope your life is peaceful. I hope you found happiness. I hope one day you remember me without regret. He stopped. The final lines were almost impossible to read, not because of the handwriting, because of the weight behind them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Evelyn rose and walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the estate ground. Moonlight reflected across the wet stone pathways below. She waited, Evelyn said quietly, even when everyone told her to stop. Sebastian looked up. Everyone? Evelyn nodded. Old memories returned more clearly now. People kept telling her to move on, to forget, to start over. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness outside. She never spoke badly about you, not once. Sebastian lowered his gaze. The realization hurt more than he expected. All those years, all those assumptions, every conclusion he reached had been wrong. Unfortunately for Adrian Keller, the evidence had become impossible to dismiss. The recovered letters, the archive records, the authorization orders. Together they painted a complete picture, not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate interference that altered 2 lives forever. Lucy shifted beneath her blanket. So Mom never gave up. Sebastian looked toward her. The child seemed smaller somehow in the oversized rooms, yet she had unknowingly become the reason the truth survived. No, he answered softly. She never did. A small smile appeared on Lucy's face. It was the smile of a child discovering something beautiful about a parent she barely remembered. For the first time since entering the library, peace briefly touched the room. Not happiness, not yet, but clarity. The mystery that began with a forgotten envelope had finally revealed its heart. Grace Foster had been innocent. She had written every letter. She had waited faithfully. She had never abandoned the connection she believed still existed. Sebastian looked at the stack of envelopes one final time. Then his attention settled on the very first letter Lucy had carried through the storm, the one that started everything, because now there was only one question left unanswered. If Grace never stopped believing in him, then what final message had she chosen to leave inside the last letter that eventually found its way back to him 18 years later? Morning arrived quietly over Chicago. The storm was gone. Pale sunlight stretched across the city as Sebastian's car followed a narrow road through an old cemetery on the northern edge of town. Dew shimmered across the grass. White clouds drifted slowly through a brightening sky. For the first time since Lucy stepped into that bus shelter, the world felt calm. The stack of recovered letters rested safely inside a leather case beside Sebastian. Every missing message had finally been found. Every misunderstanding had finally been exposed. And now there was only one place left to go. Evelyn walked beside Lucy along a winding stone path lined with maple trees. The little girl carried a bouquet of white roses almost as large as her arms. She had insisted on choosing them herself. Several rows ahead stood a simple grey headstone surrounded by wildflowers. No grand monument, no elaborate design, just a name, Grace Foster. Lucy slowed as they approached. Her small fingers tightened around the bouquet. For years she had visited this place with questions nobody could answer. Today felt different. Today she carried something her mother had lost and somehow found again. Evelyn knelt beside the grave first. The morning breeze moved gently through her hair. She traced her fingers across her sister's name. Memories returned quietly. Birthdays, laughter, long conversations in a small apartment kitchen, the sound of Grace singing while making dinner, so many moments that felt impossibly distant now. Sebastian remained a few steps back. His expression was unreadable. The centuries he carried made him seem unshakable to most people. Yet standing before Grace's grave, he looked like a man confronting a life he could never get back. Lucy carefully placed the white roses at the base of the stone. Then she stepped aside. "I think Mom would like them," she said softly. Evelyn smiled through damp eyes. "I think she would too." Silence settled over the cemetery. Birds sang somewhere among the trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches overhead. No mystery remained now, no missing records, no unanswered questions, only the truth. Sebastian finally stepped forward. He opened the leather case and removed the recovered letters. One by one, he placed them gently beside the flowers. The sight struck Evelyn unexpectedly. 18 years of missing words returned to the woman who had written them. "She never stopped believing," Sebastian said quietly. His voice carried no bitterness now, only respect. Even when she had every reason to. Evelyn looked toward him. Something had changed during the night. The weight he carried seemed lighter, not because the past could be fixed, because it no longer had to remain misunderstood. Lucy glanced up at him. "Mum would not want you to be sad forever." The simple honesty of the statement brought the faintest smile to Sebastian's face. "No," he agreed, "she would not." They remained there for a long time, talking softly, sharing stories. For the first time, Lucy heard memories of her mother from someone outside her family. Stories about bookstores, rainy afternoons, and promises made long ago. Stories that transformed Grace from a distant memory into a real person again. Eventually, the conversation faded. The morning sun climbed higher. The cemetery began to fill with light. Evelyn looked towards Sebastian. "What happens now?" she asked. He considered the question carefully. Then his gaze shifted toward Lucy. "Now," he said, "we stop letting the past decide the future." Lucy smiled. Evelyn felt something warm settle inside her chest. Not certainty, not romance, something quieter, trust, the kind built when truth finally replaces years of doubt. As they turned to leave, Sebastian glanced back one final time at the grave, the flowers, and the letters resting beneath the morning sun. And for the first time in 18 years, he felt something he thought had been lost forever. Peace. 3 months later, the city had entered the first days of autumn. Golden leaves drifted across sidewalks. Cool air carried the scent of distant rain. Life had continued moving forward, but it no longer felt burdened by unanswered questions. On a quiet Saturday morning, Lucy stood in front of her elementary school holding a small certificate she had earned for a reading competition. Pride shined across her face as she searched the crowd gathered near the entrance. The moment she spotted Evelyn, she ran forward with a smile. Then she noticed someone standing beside her aunt, someone who had become a familiar part of their lives. Sebastian Morelli accepted the certificate as though it were the most important document he had ever been handed. He studied every word carefully. Lucy laughed. "You are reading it like it is another mystery. Good documents deserve attention," Sebastian replied. The answer made both Lucy and Evelyn smile. So much had changed since that stormy evening at the bus shelter, not through dramatic declarations. Not through grand promises, through smaller moments, shared dinners, weekend visits, long conversations, the quiet rebuilding of trust. Evelyn watched Lucy talking excitedly about school while Sebastian listened with complete attention. The sight still surprised her sometimes. The powerful man she first met seemed distant now, not because he had changed completely, because she had finally learned who he really was beneath years of grief and misunderstanding. Across the city, the investigation into Adrian Keller's actions had long since concluded. The evidence had been overwhelming. Financial records revealed he had manipulated correspondence for personal gain, believing separation would make certain business arrangements easier to control. The truth had emerged. Responsibility had been acknowledged. Nothing could restore the lost years, but the lie itself no longer survived. And with the lie gone, healing became possible. Later that afternoon, the three of them returned to the cemetery carrying a bouquet of white roses. The sky was clear. Sunlight filtered gently through rows of maple trees painted in shades of gold and amber. The path felt familiar now, not sad, peaceful. Lucy placed the flowers beside Grace's headstone. Then she carefully removed something from her backpack, the original letter, the one she had carried through the rain months earlier, the one that had changed everything. Evelyn watched as her niece knelt. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. Lucy nodded. "It belongs here now." Sebastian stood quietly beside them. The words felt right. The letter had finally completed its journey, no longer lost, no longer waiting, no longer carrying unanswered questions. The wind moved gently through the trees overhead. Leaves drifted across the grass. For several minutes nobody spoke. They simply stood together in comfortable silence. Then Lucy slipped her small hand into Sebastian's. The gesture was natural, effortless, as though she had never questioned whether he belonged there. Sebastian looked down at her. A faint smile appeared. Evelyn saw it and felt something warm settle inside her heart. Not uncertainty, not fear, trust. The same trust that had been slowly growing since the night they met. Lucy looked up at both of them. Mom would be happy now. The statement was simple, honest, and nobody disagreed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery. Three figures stood together before a grave that no longer represented loss alone. It represented truth, forgiveness, and promises finally kept. As they turned to leave, the letter remained beneath the white roses where sunlight touched its faded paper. Months earlier, a little girl had stood alone beneath a storm, carrying words nobody had ever read. Now those words had reached their destination at last. And under a bright autumn sky, with no secrets left hidden and no goodbyes left unsaid, a family walked forward together toward the future.